It was dark when the French came up through the castle wall, not through the gate, not over the bridge, not with a grand charge and a horn, through the toilet. That is the story most people remember from the fall of Chateau Gaillard in 1204, the great stone fortress that Richard the Lionheart had built high above the Seine. After months of siege, men serving King Philip II of France found a weak place, climbed through a guardrobe shaft, or perhaps through a nearby chapel opening reached from that same outer line, and from there the whole mighty place began to come undone. Historians still argue about the exact hole, but they agree on the quiet insult of it. One of the strongest castles in Europe was not beaten by glory. It was beaten by patience, cold weather, and a part of the building no lord would boast about. And that, in a way, is a fine place to begin, because castles are often told to us from the top down. We hear of kings first, sieges first, banners, claims, oaths, stone walls shining over rivers. We hear of Richard, who built Chateau Gaillard to guard Normandy. We hear of King John, who failed to hold it. We hear of Philip II, who took it after a long siege that helped break English rule in Normandy. But a castle was never only its lord. It was a whole little world tucked inside stone. Even in wartime, people still had to rise in the dark and stir the fire. Bread still had to be baked. Ale still had to be brewed. Horses still had to be rubbed down and fed. Floors had to be swept. Pots had to be scrubbed. Accounts had to be written. Water had to be carried. Children had to be watched. Linen had to be dried, folded, mended, and used again. Castles were made for defense, yes, but they were also homes, storehouses, kitchens, offices, chapels, workshops, and sleeping places for whole households. English heritage puts it plainly. Medieval castles were places where people lived, worked, and played. That means the true heart of castle life was not always in the tower. A good deal of it was down by the ovens, or in the yard, or in the hall after dark. Picture the place for a moment, not as a ruin, not as a neat model in a glass case, but alive. A working castle in England or Normandy in the High Middle Ages, somewhere between 1100 and 1350. The walls are up, the ditch is cut, the gatehouse stands heavy and watchful. There is a hall where meals are taken and news is heard, a chapel for prayer, stores for grain and salted meat, stables, workshops, little chambers tucked into corners, drafts in the passages, smoke in the rafters, rushes underfoot in some rooms, mud outside when it rains, and in much of Western Europe, it does rain often enough to be remembered. It smells less like legend than you might think. Wood smoke, wet wool, horse, stew, wax, damp stone, and from certain corners, things best not named right before sleep. Not everyone inside a castle was noble, far from it. A great lord might come and go. He might spend only part of the year there. But the castle still needed hands, many hands, guards, porters, cooks, grooms, bakers, launderers, carters, masons, carpenters, clerks with ink on their fingers, chaplains with prayers to say at the right hour, boys in training, girls sent into service, messengers with sore feet, men on watch in the cold, women who knew where the keys were kept and which stores were running low and who had taken more firewood than they should. Goodrich Castle, much later than Chateau Gaillard, but useful for daily life, is described by English heritage as a thriving medieval household where sometimes hundreds of people could be living at one time. That is one of the quiet truths of the Middle Ages. A castle looked like the house of one family, but it ran on the work of many, and all those people lived close, closer than the paintings ever show. They slept near one another, ate in shared spaces, waited in passages, passed one another on stairs, heard one another cough at night, heard boots, heard babies, heard dogs shake out their ears by the fire, heard the wind push at shutters, heard the chapel bell mark the day again and again. Privacy, for most, was thin as cloth. Warmth was precious. Dry shoes were a blessing. A good place by the fire could feel like luck from heaven. So when a castle fell, it was not only a stronghold falling, it was a household being broken open. At Chateau Gaillard, that household had already been worn down by the time the walls were breached. Sieges were slow. They starved places rather than merely storming them. Food grew short. Fear grew dull. Waiting became its own kind of labor. The great stone confidence of Richard's fortress could not change the plain fact that every person inside still had a body to feed, a place to sleep, and only so much strength to spare. Philip II did not need romance. He needed time. And time in war is often stronger than stone. That is another useful thing to keep in mind tonight. Castles were built to resist the world outside, but the world inside them was always human. A king could order walls to rise on a cliff. He could call for towers, ditches, bridges, mills, and storehouses. He could set his masons and carpenters to work and make a place that looked as if it might last forever. Richard did something close to that at Chateau Gaillard in the late 12th century, planting it above the Seine to guard the road into Normandy. It was bold, it was costly, it was clever. And still, within a few years of his death, the castle passed out of his family's hands. Stone can be proud, but stone cannot carry water. Stone cannot bake oats into bread. Stone cannot stand a night watch in sleet. Stone cannot hush a child. People do that. Always people. This is why the great tales of castles can feel a little too clean. They like the view from the battlements. They like the snap of banners in the wind. They like a king on horseback, looking grave and fine in hard weather. They are less eager to talk about grease in the kitchen, or lice in bedding, or boots drying by the hearth, or a servant carrying slops down a stair, hoping not to spill any on the way. Yet those things were just as real as the towers, more real perhaps. They happened every day, and everyday things more than grand ones are what fill a life. So tonight, when we say castle, we will mean more than a fortress. We will mean a working home, a place where rank mattered, but chores did too. A place where someone at the high table might eat spiced meat on a silver dish, while someone in the next room gnawed rough bread after an hour with a bucket and broom. A place where prayer, sleep, hunger, smoke, duty, and weather all pressed close together. A place that could look grand from far away and feel cramped from within. We are used to thinking of the Middle Ages as loud with war, and they were, sometimes. But most castle, life was not battle. Most of it was waiting, preparing, repairing, counting, cooking, cleaning, watching the sky, watching the stores, watching the gate, watching one another. That slow beat is where the real story lives. Even the famous toilet story tells us more than it first seems to. It tells us that castles had latrines built into the walls. That waste had to go somewhere. That design was not only about beauty or power, but about the dull needs of the body. It tells us that the humble parts of a building could matter as much as the proud parts, and it tells us, in a very medieval way, that high things often depend on low things. Chateau Gaillard looked out over a river valley like a dream of command, but somewhere inside that dream was a shaft for human waste. And one day, that shaft mattered. There is a dry sort of comfort in that. No matter how high the tower, life still comes down to supper, sleep, cold fingers, and where the toilet is. So let the kings and sieges drift to the edge for now. Philip can wait outside the wall a little longer. Richard can keep his proud fortress on the cliff. King John can fret over Normandy. We will go inside, past the gatehouse, across the yard, into the rooms where the fire has to be lit before dawn, into the hall where the day begins in smoke and footsteps, into the castle as most people knew it, not in glory, but in daily life, and in that first grey hour, before the hall is fully warm, someone is already awake. Mist sits low around the ditch. The walls rise out of it, pale and damp, as if the castle has grown from the hill itself. A watchman stands above the gatehouse with his cloak pulled tight. Below him, the yard is already waking. A horse stamps in the straw. Somewhere near the kitchens, a door thumps shut. Smoke drifts up, then sideways, caught by the wind. Castles were built to impress and defend, but they were also crowded, noisy homes full of lords, knights, servants, soldiers, and entertainers. From far off, a castle could look almost simple. A wall, a tower, a flag if the day was kind enough for one. But close up, it was a nest of spaces, some grand, some narrow, some made for show, some made for labor. The gatehouse was not only an entrance, it was a checkpoint, a barrier, and often a place for rooms above. The hall was more than a dining room. It was where people ate, listened, judged, waited, and warmed themselves. The chapel gave the household a place to pray. Stables held horses that mattered for war, travel, hauling, and status. Kitchens, bakehouses, stores, and cellars kept the whole place alive. Castle life was never just about the keep. It was about the whole working body of the place. And where the castle stood mattered. A good castle liked a strong view, a bend in a river, a crossing on a road, a hill that asked tired legs to work harder. Goodrich Castle, for one, guarded a strategic crossing of the River Wye from its early years. Chateau Gaillard looked over the Seine Valley in Normandy. These were not accidents. A castle was placed where someone wanted to watch, tax, block, warn, or rule. Stone was not cheap, so if it was raised, there was a reason. The air inside such a place would not have felt still, not often. Even on a quiet day, there were sounds stacked on sounds, hooves on packed earth, a ladle striking the rim of a pot, a dog barking once and then again, because no one listened the first time. A bell from the chapel, boots on stairs, someone calling for more wood, someone else muttering that there had already been more wood, a clerk turning the day into marks on parchment, a servant shaking crumbs from a cloth into the yard for birds bold enough to come near. There would be smells too. Smoke first, then damp wool, horse sweat, wet leather, wax, beer, onion, ash, bread if you were lucky, and always the heavy smell of too many people living close, with only so much fresh air to go around. English heritage describes castles as full of life, bustle, and noise. That sounds right. They were not empty stone shells until long after the people had gone. The ground underfoot changed from place to place. In the outer yard, mud after rain. In workspaces, trampled straw. In better rooms, rushes or mats. In passageways, worn stone that held the night's chill long after sunrise. A cold castle was not hard to find. Even rich people lived with drafts, smoke, and the strange way damp can creep into a wall and stay there. Some rooms were made warmer with hearths, hangings, shutters, and thick bedding. Still, warmth was not spread evenly. It gathered where rank gathered. It gathered where the fire was. Everyone else did their best, and rank was plain. You could see it in cloth. You could hear it in who spoke first. You could feel it in who sat near the fire and who stood. A castle household had a shape to it. At the top were the lord and lady, if they were in residence. Around them came family, guests, chaplains, clerks, stewards, and knights. Then the wider ring of service, cooks, bakers, brewers, laundresses, grooms, watchmen, carters, messengers, and many others besides. Goodrich Castle gives us a useful glimpse of this sort of world through records tied to Countess Jeanne de Valence, who lived there for long stretches after her husband's death in 1296. Her surviving accounts show a large and complex household, part noble home and part working machine. Jeanne de Valence is worth pausing over for a moment, not because she was rare, but because the papers around her household survived. That is often the difference between silence and history. Many women ran households, ordered stores, directed servants, handled travel, and made sure the place kept moving. Joan's records help us see that work more clearly. They also remind us that castles were not fixed in one frozen pose. Great households moved from place to place. English heritage notes that Joan's family held property across many counties, and that even King Henry III moved up to 80 times in a typical year. A castle could be full one month, thinner the next, and full again when the Lord returned with guests, carts, horses, and fresh demands. So the castle breathed. It filled. It emptied. It filled again. That rhythm shaped everything. A quiet castle was one thing. A crowded one was another. When a great lady arrived, there might be more horses to stable, more mouths to feed, more beds or pallets to lay out, more candles to use, more accounts to keep, more trouble when rain turned the yard into a brown soup. There is a habit in old films of making castles seem neat, straight-backed, orderly in a polished way. Real castles were orderly too, but in a working way, not a clean way. A kitchen had to function, not gleam. A stable had to shelter animals, not smell sweet. The hall had to seat people, feed them, and warm them. One castle English heritage site describes a detached kitchen with 3 separate rooms, one for roasting and boiling, one for storage and preparation, and one for baking bread and pies. That sort of setup tells you something useful. Food was not an afterthought. It took space, heat, fuel, labor, and planning. And then there were the walls themselves, thick, yes, strong, yes, but also full of small human choices. A stair turned this way, not that. A window slit widened inside to catch more light. A garderobe jutted from a wall so waste could drop clear. A chapel sat close enough for daily use. A chamber above the hall let someone of rank be near the life of the household while still apart from it. A castle was defense shaped by daily need. That is why it feels so interesting, even now. It is both stern and domestic at once. The listener in bed, half awake, might picture a castle as grey. That is fair. But it was not only grey. Wood beams browned by smoke, rushes pale on the floor, painted walls in some fine rooms, Cloth hangings, coloured glass in a chapel if fortune had smiled, bright tunics when new, then dimmer with use, copper pots, iron hooks, red hands from work in cold water. Castles had colour. It just lived under the soot, and people inside them knew the weather very well. Not in the idle way of small talk, in the practical way. Rain changed the yard, wind changed the fire, frost changed the water bucket, heat changed the smell of the stables and the speed at which food turned. In winter, the stone itself seemed to side with the cold. In wet seasons, wool never quite forgot the damp. A castle could keep enemies out better than a cottage could, but it could not keep out every inconvenience sent by the sky. That may be one reason castles feel closer to us than they first appear. For all the rank and armour and prayer and ceremony, much of life came down to familiar things. Trying to stay dry, trying to stay warm, trying to find room, trying to get through the day with other people in close quarters. There are more nights like this on the channel. Stay if you'd like. Pause. Back to the yard. By now the place is fully awake. A cart creaks in through the gate. Someone checks what it carries. Someone else checks what it ought to have carried and did not. In the kitchen yard, work begins before comfort does. In the hall, benches wait. In the chapel, a candle may already be lit. Above, in chambers with shutters not yet opened. The finer rooms still hold a little darkness. Below, the working day has no such luxury. This, really, is the world of the castle. Not only battlements, not only banners, but a lived-in maze of stone and timber, smoke and prayer, rank and routine. A place where power sat at table, but labour kept the table standing. A place where John de Valence might keep a great household in motion, and where nameless men and women made that motion possible hour by hour. And before the first meal is properly served, before the hall grows loud, before the chores blur into one another, there is that small, plain beginning each day must have. Cold water, ashes in the hearth, clothes pulled on in dim light, the castle morning. The first feet on the floor are bare, not always, but often enough. A servant swings down from a shared bed or off a pallet laid where there was room and meets the cold of stone or board before the fire is awake. In a great household, sleeping places ran by rank. The finest young attendants might share feather beds. Soldiers might sleep in a dormitory. Lower servants often slept wherever space could be found, and many were up very early in summer, starting work around 5:30 and going on until evening. That is one of the first truths of a castle morning. The day does not begin all at once. It begins in pockets. A stir here, a cough there, the rustle of straw, the soft thud of a shoe being found in the dark by touch alone. Somewhere a door opens and the colder air from a passage slips in. Someone mutters. Someone else does not wake at all. Above them, perhaps, the Lord's chamber is still dim and warm by comparison. Below, or off to one side, the working day has already begun. The fire is first, or almost first. Last night's hearth is a bed of grey ash, with a little life left under it, if the banked coals have behaved. Someone kneels, someone blows gently. Kindling is set. Dry bits first, then larger wood. In a place built of stone, fire is comfort, light, heat, cooked food, and the thin line between a hard morning and a harder one. A castle could have thick walls and still feel raw with cold before the hearth caught properly. Pause. Then water. Always water. Fetched from a well, a cistern, or brought in pails by tired arms. It is needed for drinking, for cooking, for washing hands, for clearing yesterday from bowls and pots and faces. A castle without water was in trouble very quickly. Even a normal day asked for more of it than most of us would want to carry. Washing in the morning was usually simple. A basin, a cloth, hands, face, perhaps the neck if the water was not too biting. Medieval people were not strangers to cleanliness, but it did not look like modern cleanliness. Full bathing happened at times, and richer households could manage it more easily, but the daily habit was often smaller and plainer than that. Linen helped, combs helped, water helped when there was time and enough to spare. So a comb is drawn through sleep-flattened hair. A face is rubbed awake with cold water. A child is told to hold still. Someone does not hold still. Some things do not change much. Then come the clothes. Not in the grand way we often picture them. Not with ceremony, just layer by layer, because the day is waiting. A linen shirt or shift first, worn close to the skin. Then hose or stockings for many. Then tunic, gown or coat, tied or belted. A hood if the air bites. A veil for some women. Shoes if you have them near to hand and dry enough to be worth the trouble. Better cloth marked rank at once, better dye did too. But even plain clothes had to do many jobs. They had to warm. They had to last. They had to be patched, brushed, aired, and worn again. In a noble household, liveries might mark service. These were the household clothes given in a lord's colours. One of the small signs that a servant belonged to a great house and ate from its stores. English heritage notes that castle servants were often given such liveries along with regular meals through the year. That mattered. Clothes were costly. Food was costly too. Service was hard, but it could still be sought after work. The castle is louder now. In the stable, horses are being seen to, before many humans have eaten. In the kitchen, yesterday's calm is gone. Fires are up. Knives are out. Water is heating. Bread from earlier baking may be cut or set out. Ale is ready because ale was daily drink for many, safer than poor water in some places and already part of the household rhythm from morning onward. In a big castle, the kitchen did not wake slowly. It woke with purpose. One account from Goodrich Castle shows just how busy such work could become. Countess Joan de Valence's cook, Isaac of the kitchen, might have to feed as many as 200 people in a day. Isaac of the kitchen. That is the kind of name that brings a lost world a little closer. Not a famous knight, not a king, just a man known by his work. And there were many like him. John the baker, Richard the sorcerer, names that come to us because someone had to buy flour, count fish, note wages, or explain where the pepper had gone. Much of medieval life survives because somebody kept a list. That is true of the great as well as the small. The household role of Eleanor de Montfort in 1265 is precious for the same reason. It lets historians watch a noble household move through real days with real expenses, instead of drifting off into legend. Eleanor de Montfort's world was not exactly every castle's world. No single record can do that. Still, the role helps with the feel of things. It shows a household as a chain of needs met one after another. Food bought, supplies counted, movement tracked, people fed because if they were not fed, nothing else in the house could be done. Even in a fine residence, mourning was practical before it was graceful. And grace, when it came, often came through habit. A prayer said while dressing, a sign of the cross before food, a bell from the chapel, a child taught to stand still a little longer than yesterday, a page trying to look sharp and not sleepy. English heritage notes that the poshest young servants, pages and damsels from good families, were in effect learning manners by serving in a great household. They even shared featherbeds, which sounds soft until you remember the sharing. The lower you stood, the less the morning belonged to you. That may be the plainest way to say it. A lord might wake behind a door. A servant woke inside the day already in motion. The broom needs taking up. The rushes need seeing to. The ash bucket needs emptying. The chamber pots have not walked themselves away in the night. The water has not carried itself. The horse does not care that dawn feels too early. And yet, even here, there are little human pauses. A hand held over fresh fire. A crust stolen and eaten fast. Two workers speaking softly before the hall fills, and the rank of the place settles back onto their shoulders. A mother smoothing a child's hair with wet fingers. A young boy proud of pulling on a belt by himself. The sort of things no clerk bothered to write down. The sort of things that happened anyway. If this is helping you unwind, a subscribe means more of these quiet nights. Pause. Now, where were we? Yes, the morning. By now the castle has found its rhythm. Not fast, not slow, steady. Boots on stair, pail on hook. Wood on flame, pot on trivet. Comb through hair, gate unbarred. Day begun. Somewhere in that rhythm stands a woman like Eleanor de Montfort or Joan de Valence. A little later, knowing without fuss that a household does not run on walls alone. It runs on timing, on stores, on memory, on labour done before most people notice it. It runs on the morning being got right. Enough fuel, enough bread, enough order that the rest of the day may follow. Their records survive because they were great women, but the shape of the work around them belonged to many unnamed hands as well. And now the softer part of morning is over. The first washing is done, the clothes are on, the fire has caught, the yard is busy, the kitchen is loud, the hall is waiting. Soon the castle will be deep in its daily labour, with all its lifting, stirring, carrying, counting, mending, fetching, and watching. The work. By mid-morning, the castle stops feeling like a home and starts feeling like a machine. Not a fast machine, a human one. A slow one made of backs, hands, smoke, mud, and memory. In the kitchen yard, someone is chopping wood. In the stable, someone is rubbing down a horse that'll only be muddy again by noon. In the bakehouse, flour dust hangs in the air and settles on sleeves, on lashes, on the cracks in the work table. In the hall, a servant lifts benches, straightens boards, and wipes away what last night left behind. Elsewhere, a clerk bends over parchment, turning sacks of grain and barrels of ale into lines of ink. Castle life depended on constant labor, much of it repetitive and easy to miss, unless it stopped being done. That is the thing about work in a castle. It did not come in neat little pieces. Jobs ran into each other. The cook needed water. The water needed carrying. The bucket needed mending. The cooper needed wood. The wood needed cutting. The horse needed oats to pull the cart that brought the grain that fed the people who did the rest. A castle could look stern and still be held together by chains of small tasks, each one plain, each one necessary. Some work was loud, hammer on nail, axe on block, hoof on cobble, ladle on pot. Some work was almost silent, a seam being stitched, a pen scratching, a key turning in a storeroom lock, a woman counting cloth lengths with her fingers, a chaplain turning a page, and much of it was done again, and again, and again. That rhythm is not an accident here. It was the rhythm of the place. Feed the fire, sweep the floor, carry the water, check the stores, clean the pot, brush the horse, lift the sack, close the shutter, open it later. For the grand people in the castle, work could mean management, judgment, reading letters, hearing disputes, planning travel, and deciding how stores should be spent. For most others, it meant using the body until the task was done. Joan de Valence's household at Goodrich Castle gives a useful glimpse of that wider world. Her accounts show not only noble life, but a whole community of service around it, from kitchen staff to stable hands, to clerks and other servants who kept the house running. There is a quiet dignity in that kind of labor. Not because it was easy. It was not. Not because people loved every minute of it. They did not, but because real skill lived there. A baker had to know heat by sight and feel. A groom had to read a horse's temper before teeth or hooves made the point more sharply. A cook had to keep order among timing, fuel, stores, and hunger. A laundress had to fight stains, weather, and sore hands. A clerk had to make numbers behave. None of this was grand in the way songs like grand things. But a castle without skillful workers was only a pile of expensive problems. Take the kitchen. It was one of the hardest working places in the whole castle. English heritage describes castle kitchens as busy, smoky spaces, and at some sites the cooking work was split across separate rooms for roasting and boiling, storage and preparation, and baking. That tells you how much food mattered and how much effort went into making it appear on time. Fire had to be fed, meat had to be turned, dough had to be watched, broth had to keep from catching at the bottom, and all of this had to happen while people walked in and out asking for one thing or another. Then the stables. A castle horse was not a decoration. It was transport, status, muscle, speed, war sometimes. Horses needed feed, grooming, mucking out, checks for injury, and a watchful eye. Stables were warm in one sense and hard in another. There was always something to clear, something to lift, something to notice before it turned into trouble. The same was true in storage rooms. They may sound dull. That is only because they worked. Grain had to stay dry. Al had to be watched. Salted food had to be counted. Wax, cloth, fuel, iron goods, and spices in richer houses all had to be kept, guarded, and measured out. The household role of Eleanor de Montfort is so useful because it lets us see that hidden side of noble life. Not just the people at table, but the stream of supplies that made the table possible in the first place. Even cleanliness was work, not modern cleanliness, just the daily fight against mess, ash, mud, grease, spilled ale, straw dragged where it should not be, rushes gone sour, pots blackened by fire, trenches to clear, chamber pots to empty, latrines to keep from becoming worse than they already were. The Grand Castle story has little use for this. Real castle life had a great deal of it, and there were jobs that sat low in the eyes of others, but high in usefulness. Waste had to go somewhere. Garderobes, the castle latrines built into or out from the walls, were clever in a blunt sort of way. They remind us that even fine buildings had to deal with plain bodily needs. Keeping such systems usable was work no one praised much, but everyone depended on. A dry little joke could hide there. The castle might be built for honor, but someone still had to deal with where honor went after supper. Not all work stayed inside the walls either. Carts came in, carts went out, messengers rode, timber arrived, food arrived, news arrived. Sometimes unwelcome guests arrived too. A castle sat in a wider world of fields, roads, rivers, woods, mills, villages, and markets. The walls did not cut it off from life. They pulled life inward and sent orders back outward. Even a strong castle relied on the countryside around it. And above all this stood time. Dinner would not wait because someone was tired. A horse wouldn't stay hungry out of kindness. A fire wouldn't keep itself. That is what makes castle work feel so modern in one small way. However distant the clothes and customs may be, much of the day came down to the same old rule. Do the task now, or the next task gets worse. So 1 hour passes into the next. The broom goes back and then comes out again. The pot is scrubbed and then blackened again. The pail is filled and then emptied. The ledger line is written and then another line follows it. The work is never really finished. It is only handed forward. That may be why so many named people from castle records are named by their jobs. Isaac of the kitchen, clerks, stewards, cooks, bakers. We meet them in fragments because the work itself left marks behind. A king left a seal. A servant left a line in an account. Both are part of the story. By now, the hardest edge of mourning has worn down. The castle is deep in its labor, steady now, predictable, almost soothing, if you are not the one carrying the sack. And through all this lifting and scraping and stirring, another thought begins to take shape. Soon people will eat. The smell of it is already in the air. Bread, broth, meat maybe, ale, the slow reward at the heart of all this work. The table, by the time the food reaches the hall, half the work of the castle has already been done. Wood burned for it, water was carried for it, flour was ground for it. Hands, many hands, have been awake for hours so that a meal can seem to arrive almost by magic. It never did. It always came by labor. The hall is warmer now, not warm in the soft way we mean it today, but warmer than the yard, warmer than the stair, warmer than the stone passage where the draught always seems to find your ankles. Benches are set out. Boards are laid on trestles. At the high table, the lord, lady, honoured guests, and close households sit in the best places. Farther down are others of lower rank. In a castle, eating filled the belly, but it also showed the order of the house. English heritage notes that castles were crowded working homes, and feasting at the upper end of the hall made rank visible to everyone else in the room. The meal itself depends on who you are. For many people in and around a castle, daily food was plain and steady. Bread, pottage, ale, cheese, beans or peas, onions, leeks, herbs, maybe eggs, maybe fish, maybe a little meat when the stores, season and rank allowed it. Pottage was the old reliable thing, a thick pot of whatever could be stretched, stirred and eaten hot. It is not hard to see why such food lasted. It fed many people. It forgave leftovers. And after a morning of work, it would have tasted very good indeed. Medieval household records like those behind the Helena de Montfort roll matter because they show meals as part of a real supply chain, not a painted feast. At the high table, the food could be finer. Better bread, more meat, better wine. Imported spices if the purse was deep enough. On grand days there might be several courses, served in a show of abundance as much as hunger. English Heritage's discussion of medieval feasting notes high starter serving dishes, silverware, and bread trenchers used as plates, their surface soaking up meat juices before being passed on to those lower in the room. It is a lovely small detail. Even the plate might begin as food. Bread sat at the heart of all this, not only as something to chew, but as a measure of what sort of meal you were having. Fine white bread, made from better sifted wheat flour, marked higher status. Darker loaves, rougher grain, maslin mixes, and harder crusts belonged more often to ordinary tables. A castle kitchen did not simply make dinner, it sorted the world into portions. This loaf for them, that loaf for others. In a society built on rank, the crumb itself could tell you where you stood. Then there was ale, not the strong drink of a late and foolish night, just daily ale, common ale, household ale. For many, it was safer and more reliable than poor water, and it came into the rhythm of the day so naturally that even morning did not seem too early for it. In a working castle, drink was not a side note. It had to be stored, watched, served, and sometimes brewed in quantity. Even the later word butler comes from the buttery, the room where wine and ale were kept. That old link between food, drink, and service goes back deep into household life. The kitchen behind the meal was its own rough kingdom. Smoke in the rafters, heat at the face, ash underfoot, cooks moving with purpose, not ceremony. English Heritage describes some castle kitchens as split into separate rooms for roasting and boiling, for preparation and storage, and for baking bread and pies. That tells you just how much planning sat behind what later looked like ease. A platter arriving on time can hide a great deal of sweating, and there were many mouths to think about. At Goodrich Castle, the surviving accounts of Countess Jeanne de Valence show a household that could range from about 122 to 196 people as it moved between residences. Feeding such a body of people was not a matter of taste alone. It was a problem of numbers. Grain, fuel, fish, meat, ale, salt, cloth for table use, candles for dark meals, and wages or liveries for those doing the work. Joan's world helps us see the castle table as a system, not just a scene. There is comfort in that somehow. Someone had to remember the stores. Someone had to know when the flour ran low. Someone had to keep an eye on salt fish in Lent. Someone had to notice that the apples would not last another week. Someone had to make sure the hall was ready before the first hungry person sat down and looked as though the meal had failed them personally. This is not the grand kind of history. It is the useful kind. Meals also changed with the church year. Fast days mattered. Fish days mattered. The line between feast and restraint was part of the shape of medieval life. A rich table in one season might look plainer in another, at least in public rule, if not always in private feeling. That rhythm, too, made the meal more than food. It tied the body to the calendar. For now, it is enough to picture the room. A servant carrying bread with both hands, a bowl of pottage giving off steam, a knife laid down on wood, a cup of ale, a child hoping for a better bit, a dog under the table, patient in the way only a dog near food can be patient. Voices rise, then settle. The meal begins. If you're still with me, a quiet like helps others find this place. Pause. And what did it taste like? Less sugar than we know, more smoke, more salt at times, more hunger before it. A warm meal after work does not need much poetry. It earns its place by being warm, by filling the body, by stopping the hollow feeling for a little while. That may be why medieval food can seem both plain and deeply human. It was shaped by weather, rank, religion, labor, and the limits of storage. But at its heart, it was still the old hope that supper would be enough. At the high end of the hall, there may be better cuts, better cups, finer cloth. At the lower end, rougher fare. Still, the table does something rare. For a little while, it gathers the house into one shared act. Not equal, never that, but shared. The workers who chopped wood, stirred pots, fetched water, counted stores, and laid boards all meet here in one form or another, if not in one place. Their labor turns into bread, broth, and silence while chewing. And after the meal, of course, the work begins again. Bowls to clear, cloths to shake, bones to gather, ale to fetch, fire to tend. Nothing in a castle stays finished for long. Still, there is a small peace in this middle hour, the stomach full, the hall dim and warm, the body settled for a moment into itself. And from there, very gently, we can turn to the body itself, its aches, its washing, its smells, its small vanities, its ways of being kept together. The body, a small basin waits on a stool. The water in it is cold. A cloth hangs nearby, a comb, a bit of linen, a little pot that may hold salve or scent, or nothing much at all. The castle body begins here, not in battle, not in glory, in the daily work of keeping skin, hair, teeth, belly, and bones in some kind of order. It is easy to speak too simply about cleanliness in the Middle Ages. People were not filthy because they liked being filthy. They washed as they could, with what they had, when there was time, water, fuel, and privacy enough to make it possible. Hands were washed before meals, faces were washed. Linen worn close to the skin helped soak up sweat and could be changed more often than a heavier outer garment. Combs mattered, fresh air mattered, clean cloth mattered. Full baths happened too, though not in the easy daily way a modern bathroom makes possible. So much of bodily care came down to small acts. Rinse the hands, wipe the face, comb the hair, air the bedding, shake out the wool, turn the mattress. Warm the water if the day allows it. These are modest things, but modest things hold a life together. Hair was work. Long hair had to be kept from tangling. Beards had to be trimmed, or at least managed. Head coverings had their own rules, shaped by rank, sex, age, and custom. A woman in a noble household might keep her hair covered in public. A servant might care less for style than for getting through the day with hair pinned out of the fire and away from the stew. A comb was not a luxury in such a world. It was a useful friend, and also, from time to time, a weapon against lice. Lice belong in this story because lice belonged in many medieval lives. Crowded rooms, shared bedding, wool, travel, and limited washing all helped them along. People knew they were a nuisance. They picked them out. They combed for them. They washed what they could. There is no need to make it worse than that. It was simply one more dull battle of daily life, like damp shoes or a smoky room. The teeth had their own troubles. Not everyone had rotten teeth all the time, and not everyone had fine teeth either. Diet mattered. Age mattered. Luck mattered. Medieval medicine included recipes for mouth care, though results surely varied. What we can say safely is that people cared about bad breath, tooth pain, and appearance enough to try things. A sore tooth in a castle, as anywhere, had the power to make the whole day feel meaner than usual. Then there is smell, the plain fact of it. A castle was not scentless. Smoke clung to cloth. Animals were near. Rushes on floors could sweeten a room for a while, then do the opposite. People worked hard and wore layers. Latrines existed because bodies do what bodies do. A fine household might soften the edges with herbs, perfumes, clean linen, wax, and fresh greenery in season. But no one was living inside a bowl of lavender all day. The air was a blend of effort. The latrines themselves were built right into castle life. Guardrobes, the castle toilets, were often set in projecting chutes or small chambers in the walls, so waste could fall clear below. They were practical, unlovely, but practical. Their very presence tells us something useful. Even the grandest household was still a household of human bodies, and stone had to make room for that. It was true at Chateau Gaillard. It was true almost everywhere. A medieval castle could reach for heaven in its chapel, and still need a toilet in the wall. That seems fair. Women's bodily life is harder to recover in detail, not because it mattered less, but because records so often cared more about money and land than private discomfort. We know noble women and their attendants managed childbirth, nursing, monthly bleeding, sickness, bathing, laundry, and the endless care of cloth. We know linen was precious here too. We know warm water, privacy, and help from other women would have mattered greatly. But many specifics are hard to pin down, and honesty is better than pretending otherwise. Illness could sit anywhere in the castle, in a noble chamber, in a servant's bed, by the fire, in the stable yard. Medicine in the High Middle Ages was a mix of learned texts, old practice, prayer, herbs, diet, and hope. Some remedies helped, some likely did little. Rest itself, when it could be had, was a kind of treatment. So was warmth, so was broth, so was a patient person nearby with enough time to notice that something had changed. Medieval households used what they knew. They did not know germs in the modern sense, but they knew that foul air, bad water, spoiled food, and neglect could make a body worse. For pain, there were herbs and poultices. For fever, coolness, prayer, waiting. For a bruise, perhaps rest if the work allowed it. Often it did not. That is another quiet truth. Bodies in a castle were used hard. A groom lifted sacks and bent over hooves. A cook stood in heat. A laundress worked with cold water and weight. A guard stood in wind. A mason strained shoulders and hands. Even the noble body had its burdens: riding, childbirth, travel, long meals, cold rooms, and the stiff etiquette of rank. Beauty lived here too, in a subdued way. A cleaner veil, a scented glove, hair smoothed down, hands rubbed with something softening after washing, better teeth if fortune smiled, better skin if rank sheltered you from weather and labour. The wish to look well is not a modern wish. It is an old one. The body was the first thing the world saw of you, and in a castle where people lived so close, it was always being read. Still, most bodily care was less about beauty than about endurance. How to stay serviceable, how to sleep enough to rise again, how to stop the crack in your skin from getting worse, how to keep your feet from failing you, how to get through winter with your chest clear and your fingers still willing. The body was not a project. It was a tool, a tender one, and tools wore down. We see that in bones found by archaeologists from medieval sites, where years of labor often left marks on joints, backs, and teeth. The evidence is broad rather than castle only, but it fits the world well enough. Hard lives leave traces, not dramatic ones, always, just the slow handwriting of work on the frame. Yet for all that, there were comforts. Warm water when you could get it, a fresh shirt, a better straw mattress, a comb through clean hair, a seat by the fire, a bowl of broth, a hand on the shoulder from someone who noticed you looked tired. That last one may have mattered most. The body does not live alone. It is fed by other people, washed by them sometimes, nursed by them, carried in the worst moments, laughed with, missed, loved. And so, from the plain truth of skin and bone, we come gently to the ties that made castle life more bearable than stone alone ever could. The bonds. A child has fallen asleep on a bench by the wall. One shoe is half off. A dog lies under the table nearby, still hopeful, even in dreams. At the far end of the hall, two women fold linen and speak in low voices. Someone lifts the child without waking him. Someone else gathers the shoe. This is also castle life, not just duty, care. A castle household was not a small, neat family in the modern way. It was wider than that, messier too. There might be a lord and lady, their children if they were there, kinsmen, guests, pages sent in for training, young women serving in attendance, clerks, chaplains, nurses, grooms, cooks, guards, older servants who had seen 3 generations grow up and thought little of it. Some were bound by blood, some by marriage, some by wages, some by oath, some simply by long habit, which combine people almost as tightly as love. English Heritage's work on Goodrich Castle shows this plainly in the large household of Joan de Valence, where daily life depended on many people living and working in close company over time. That closeness shaped feeling. People in castles did not live at a safe distance from one another. They heard one another sneeze. They knew who walked heavily and who did not. They knew whose child cried in the night. They knew who sulked, who sang softly while working, who always cut bread too thick, who remembered birthdays of saints, who borrowed needles and forgot to return them. Affection grows in such knowledge. So does irritation, often side by side. Marriage sat at the centre of noble castle life, though not always in the warm way storybooks prefer. For the high-born, marriage was often about land, alliance and safety for a family line. A girl might be wed very young in law, though married life in practice could begin later. A widow might find herself suddenly with real power over lands and household decisions. Love was not the first thing records cared to mention. But that does not mean love was absent. It means parchment had other priorities. Jeanne de Valence is useful here as well. After the death of her husband, William de Valence, in 1296, she ran an important noble household and moved among her estates, including Goodrich. The records around her do not tell us every feeling she had. Records rarely do, but they do show steadiness, competence, and a life built from ties to children, servants, clerks, tenants, and kin. A household like hers did not hold together by command alone. It held together because enough people, every day, kept faith with one another's roles. And then there were the children. A castle had children in it even when the records look stern. Children ran in passages. Children learned prayers. Children learned to stand back when sharp tools were moving through a room. A noble boy might be taught letters, manners, riding, prayer, and the first edges of warfare. A noble girl might learn household order, faith, reading in some cases, sewing, estate sense, and the quiet art of noticing everything. Other children, born to servants or workers near the household, would learn by doing, by helping, by carrying, by watching older hands. Not one childhood, many. Still, across rank, there were the same small acts. A hem straightened, a face wiped, a sleeping child carried from bench to bed, a warning given before a stare, a crust saved, a fever watched through the dark. These things do not often survive in writing, but the people did. So their acts must have happened too. Service could create bonds almost like kinship. A page might be sent to a lord's household while still quite young, to learn how to serve, speak, dress, ride, and belong in a noble world. English heritage notes that pages and damsels in great houses were often the sons and daughters of gentle families, placed there in part for training. They learned obedience, grace, and rank, but they also grew up together. Shared lessons and shared meals have a way of making their own kind of family. Among lower servants too, friendship must have mattered. How could it not? Work was long. Rooms were crowded. Life was uncertain. A friendly voice at the wash place. A joke muttered in the pantry. Someone saving you a better place near the fire. Someone taking your turn for a moment because your hands were split from the cold. These are not grand deeds, but most comfort is not grand. And grief lived in castles as surely as laughter did. Children died, mothers died. Old servants disappeared from the rolls and did not come back. Men rode out and failed to return. A place that held so many lives close together could not help but feel lost deeply. Medieval people were used to death in a way that we are not. But being used to a thing does not make it light. It only makes it familiar. Perhaps that is why tenderness mattered so much, not softness. There was not enough ease in castle life for softness to rule it. But tenderness, yes. In practical forms, a blanket tucked closer, a cup brought without asking, a place made by the hearth, a message carried quickly, a widow not left alone in the first stunned days, a child taught a prayer by heart because it felt like shelter. The records of Eleanor de Montfort offer a different sort of human story. Her household role from 1265 comes from a year of war and uncertainty, when her husband Simon de Montfort's cause was collapsing. The document is mostly about supply and movement, the hard bones of survival. Yet that is what makes it moving. It shows a household staying together under strain. Food still had to be bought. People still had to be fed. Routes still had to be managed. Care, in such moments, can look a great deal like administration. That is worth sitting with. Care does not always look tender from the outside. Sometimes it looks like counting sacks. Sometimes it looks like getting everyone under a roof. Sometimes it looks like making sure there is bread tomorrow. Sometimes love wears the face of competence. In a castle, people depended on one another in ways that were hard to ignore. The cook depended on the carter on the smith on the steward who paid or supplied him, the steward on the clerk on the servant who kept his candle trimmed and his table steady. Even the lord, for all his rank, depended on many people whose names he may not have spoken often enough. No one in a castle was truly self-made. The walls themselves argued against that, and in the evening, when the labour slackened a little, these bonds would show most clearly. Not in speeches, not in noble vows, in who sat beside whom, in who shared news from outside, in who noticed silence and asked after it, in who was missed when absent. A household becomes a kind of map of these quiet loyalties. You can almost feel them in the room. There is a gentle comfort in knowing that the medieval castle, for all its rank and hardness, still ran on old human things: trust, habit, patience, shared burdens, shared bread, the relief of not being alone in a cold place. And from those bonds, it is only a small step to the things people leaned on when human care was not enough. Prayer, saints, signs, fears, hope in the dark, the beliefs. A small flame trembles in the chapel. Wax softens. Smoke lifts. Stone holds the sound of a single voice a moment longer than the voice itself. Outside, the yard still has mud, horses and carts. Inside, the room is made for something slower. For many people, in the Middle Ages, belief was not a side part of life. It sat inside the shape of the day. English heritage notes that for most people, the church was the centre of religious life, and that Mass, saints' days, and church rites marked the year from cradle to grave. In a castle, that same pattern came indoors through the household chapel, the chaplain, and the habits of prayer folded into daily routine. A castle chapel was often small, not small in meaning, just in size. It might be tucked within the main range, set above another room, or placed close enough to the hall and chambers that the household could reach it easily. A lord and lady might hear Mass there. So might close attendants. So might servants when custom, time and space allowed. The chapel made the castle feel complete. Walls could guard the body. The chapel was there for the soul. English heritage's wider material on medieval England shows how closely Norman rule, castles, and church life were bound together from the start. The day itself had holy edges, a prayer before food, a bell, a blessing said half by habit and half by hope, a sign of the cross in a moment of worry. That is one of the calm truths of medieval belief. It was grand in churches, yes, but it was also small and close to hand. It lived in memory, in repeated words, in the steady comfort of doing what had always been done. English heritage describes medieval religion as woven into ordinary life through Sundays, saints' days, and life events. That weaving matters here. In a castle, prayer did not always interrupt the day. Often, it simply ran through it. Saints were part of that world too. Not in an abstract way, in a practical way. People asked for help, protection, healing, safe travel, a child through fever, a good death when the time came. The cult of Thomas Becket shows just how real such devotion was in medieval England. After his murder in 1170, he quickly became one of the most important saints in the country, and people prayed to him because they believed he worked miracles. That kind of hope would have been familiar in castle life, where danger, illness, and uncertainty were never very far off. And belief was not only about comfort, it was also about fear. Not terror all the time, just the old human fears, bad harvests, sickness, sudden death, sin left unconfessed, a journey gone wrong, a baby too weak, a winter too long. The church gave these fears a language and a frame. It offered confession, prayer, ritual, feast, fast, burial, and the hope that suffering was not meaningless. English heritage's overview makes the point clearly. Church ritual marked life from the cradle to the grave. That mattered because medieval life gave people many chances to need such ritual. In a castle, the chaplain had a quiet but real place in the household. He said Mass. He kept books. He prayed for the living and the dead. He may also have taught children, read letters, or helped give the house a moral shape, at least in theory. A castle was a place of power, and power liked to be blessed. But the chaplain was not there only for the mighty. The presence of a chapel meant that prayer, confession, and remembrance could happen without leaving the walls. In that way, the holy sat close to the hearth, the hall, and the bedchamber. The church here changed the feel of time. That may be easy to miss now, but then it mattered deeply. Feast days brightened the calendar, fast days slowed it. Lent changed the table, Easter changed the mood. Saints' days gave names and stories to the passing weeks. Medieval people did not move through one flat year. They moved through sacred time. English heritage says these festivals and saints' days were interwoven with daily life and the agricultural year. In a castle, they were interwoven with household life as well. The kitchen, chapel, and hall all felt their pull. There were also beliefs that sat a little outside formal teaching. Protective habits, old sayings, lucky or unlucky signs, things done because a mother had done them and her mother before her. Historians have to tread softly here, because written records do not always make neat lines between religion, custom, and superstition. But we know the medieval world was full of signs and meanings. People looked for order in weather, illness, dreams, and accidents. They lived close to uncertainty, and uncertainty makes room for ritual. The official church did not approve of every local custom, but local custom has never waited politely for approval. Death stood near enough to shape belief, but not always in a dramatic way. Sometimes it was simply there. A funeral bell, a prayer for a soul, a child taught to remember the dead, a widow in black cloth, a place in the chapel where names were spoken softly. The medieval church offered people a way to think about death as part of a larger road, with judgment, prayer, memory, and the hope of mercy beyond it. For people in castles, as anywhere else, that hope must have been a kind of shelter, not a full answer, but a shelter. There is a quiet tenderness in that old religious world, not because it was simple, it was not simple. Not because everyone believed in the same way, with one clear mind and no doubt. They did not, but because it gave shape to helpless moments. A body in pain, a child in danger, a husband away on the road, a household afraid of what winter might bring. In such moments, prayer is not a theory. It is something to do with your hands, your voice, and your fear. And then there was the chapel itself, the little room, the candle, the cold stone, the same word said again and again across years of births, meals, quarrels, storms, journeys, and deaths. That repetition may be the most soothing part of all. Castles could be noisy, uncertain places, but in the chapel, things returned. The prayers returned, the seasons returned, the hope returned even after grief. So when night began to lower over the walls, belief came with it. Not as a sermon, as habit, a last prayer, a blessing over the bed, a thought for the dead, a candle left burning a little longer. And beyond the chapel door, the castle itself was growing dim, the noise thinning, the work easing, the dark gathering in the yard, the night. A wooden bar slides into place. The gate is shut. The yard grows still, not silent. A castle is rarely silent, but quieter now. The loud work is done. No more carts, less shouting. Only the sounds that belong to dark. A horse shifting in straw. A dog turning twice. A spoon set down, boots on a stair. A cough behind a door, wind at the shutter. This is how the castle changes at night. Not all at once, slowly, by degrees. Light draws inward. Rooms shrink to candle size. The great dark outside the walls grows larger than the fire within. In the hall, the meal is over. Boards may be cleared from trestles, crumbs brushed away, bones gathered, jugs lifted, cloths folded. A servant stoops for the last time that day and feels it in the back. Someone banks the fire, not out, just lower, enough to last, enough to help the morning start again. That mattered. Fire was work. Losing it meant more work. So the coals were kept, hidden under ash. Little red life for later. Elsewhere, shutters are checked, doors fastened, latches touched by hand, then touched again. At a castle gate, closing up was part of the daily rhythm. The building did not merely stand there being strong. People had to make it secure each evening with bolts, bars, watches, and habit. Then the watch begins, or goes on, because some people do not really get a night. They get darkness with duties in it, a guard at the wall walk, a porter near the gate, a servant roused if someone important rings, a groom listening for trouble in the stable. The night has ranks too. Some sleep behind doors, some near the fire, some where they fall, some lightly, some at once. A noble chamber may hold a bed with curtains, blankets, a chest, a stool, a candle guttering low, a servant nearby perhaps. Beyond that room, others lie closer together, on truckle beds, on pallets, on benches, on straw, on whatever the household can spare. And There is always the cold, not heroic cold, just steady cold, the sort that creeps through stone, finds the floor, reaches the fingers, makes a person curl tighter in sleep. Still, there are comforts, small ones. A cloak pulled up, a warmer place by the hearth, a child carried half asleep, a dog against the feet, a familiar snore in the dark. The castle is gentler now, even the smells change. Less cooking, more ash, less sweat, more wool, wax, smoke, night air through a crack. Talk, if it still goes on, is softer. A bit of mending by firelight, a story told low, news from the road, a prayer half whispered, then less again. You can feel how close people lived at this hour, how near, breath near breath, cough near cough, dream near dream. A whole household folded into itself, not equal, but together. This is the hour when absence is felt too, the bench where someone usually sits, the servant missing from the corner, the child sent away to foster, the rider not yet back. At night, the gaps show. No one says much about them. They are simply there. In a place like Goodrich, or any busy medieval household, daytime records tell us numbers, stores, servants, rooms. Night tells us something else, though mostly by guess rather than ink. It tells us how all those people must have settled into the same dark, each carrying a different burden into sleep. The chapel may still hold a little light. A last prayer said, a saint remembered, a soul commended to God. Then the door closes there too. Outside the walls, the world has not ended. There is still river water moving, still wind in grass, still someone on the road, perhaps wishing for a roof, still stars when cloud allows, but inside the household draws close, and sleep begins its quiet work. The watchman shifts his weight, the embers settle, a horse sighs. Somewhere in the dark, a child turns over and sleeps on. Now the castle is almost only warmth and shadow, almost only breathing, almost only the red eye of the fire. And from here, there is not much left to say. Only the dim hall, the last coal, the long dark, the silence. The hall is empty now. The benches wait in the dark. The boards are gone from the trestles. Only the shape of the room remains. A little red still lives in the hearth. Not flame, not quite, just heat. A faint glow under ash. The rushes are still. The air smells of smoke, of wool, of the last of the fire. Beyond the shutters the night goes on. Wind over the ditch, cloud past the moon. The slow black outline of the wall. Inside the castle sleeps the lord, the lady, the cook, the groom, the child on the pallet, the guard who will wake again before dawn. Stone all around them, stone under them, stone keeping the weather out. Not all of it, just enough. Somewhere a horse moves in its stall, then stops. Somewhere else, a sleeper sighs. A bedrope creaks, then nothing. This was castle life too. Not only the feast, not only the toil, not only the prayer. This, the stillness after. A folded cloth, a banked fire, a cup left by a bed, shoes set side by side, a comb on a stool, a hood on a peg. Tomorrow the work will begin again. Water, wood, bread, boots on stairs. But not yet. For now, no one is asking. No one is carrying. No one is counting. The ledgers rest. The ladles rest. The hands rest. The castle, for a few hours, belongs to sleep. Even the watchman speaks to no one. Even the dog has stopped dreaming. And in that dark, the great stone place becomes small again. A household. A few warm bodies under wool. A few embers holding on. A little chapel lamp gone low. A silence shared by rich and poor alike. Not the same bed, not the same blanket, not the same cares, but the same night, the same dark over England, over Normandy, over tower and stable, over hall and wall, over all the small forgotten lives that kept such places going. The candle thins, the red in the hearth fades, the room softens into shadow, the castle sleeps, and so, at last, should we.